It was one of those deceptively peaceful evenings in the suburbs, the kind where the golden sunlight spilled gently across the picket fences, kids' laughter floated in the distance, and the scent of freshly cut grass promised that nothing could possibly go wrong. But inside Michael and Laura's modest two-story home, the fragile balance of their lives revolved around their daughter Sophie, a bright-eyed girl of only 9 who, despite her wheelchair and limited mobility, carried more joy in her smile than most adults could ever muster. Laura had just wheeled Sophie onto the porch to let her enjoy the breeze, her tiny fingers clutching a stuffed bunny whose ear was almost worn off from years of comfort, and for a moment everything felt calm, until the familiar sharp click of heels on concrete echoed up the walkway and shattered the illusion of peace, because striding toward them was Mrs. Patterson, the HOA president, a woman with iron gray hair pulled back, so tight it looked painful, lips pursed in permanent disapproval, and eyes that carried the kind of cold judgment that made neighbors shrink when she appeared. "Laura," she said, voice dripping with disdain, "I've told you time and again, noise levels must be kept under control. Your daughter's squeals are disturbing the community," and Laura's jaw clenched as she tried to explain again that Sophie wasn't being disruptive, she was simply laughing at the neighborhood cat chasing a butterfly across the lawn. But Patterson's expression hardened like stone, her gaze darting briefly to the wires running from Sophie's custom wheelchair to the small portable charger beside the porch step, and though Laura didn't notice at first, Patterson's stare lingered too long, a calculating darkness flickering behind her eyes that hinted she wasn't merely irritated, she was dangerous. Michael, stuck in late traffic from his job across town, had no idea that while he gripped his steering wheel and cursed the gridlock, his daughter's life was hanging in the balance, and Laura, exhausted from years of trying to placate the tyrannical HOA, tried once more to soften Patterson with reason, her voice trembling. "She's just a child. Please, she can't walk. She doesn't have the world. Most kids have let her laugh." But Patterson's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer, and she hissed, "Rules are rules, Laura, and if you won't discipline her, I'll make sure she learns to be quiet." The words didn't register fully until Patterson stepped closer under the guise of inspecting the porch rail, her manicured fingers brushing across the charger cable as if absent-mindedly, yet with a deliberate flick she tugged it, adjusted it, twisted it back in place, and something subtle but sinister clicked within the mechanism. A tampering too small for Laura to notice in the fading light, but enough to send dread crawling up Sophie's fragile body the moment Laura turned her back to fetch a glass of water. "Mommy?" Sophie's tiny voice wavered. But before Laura could respond, the crackle of electricity screamed through the air, and Sophie convulsed violently, her little stuffed bunny dropping to the wooden floorboards as her body jolted against the restraints of the wheelchair, a horrifying scream tearing through the calm evening, so raw and piercing that birds scattered from nearby trees, and Laura's glass shattered against the ground as she spun, horror flooding her veins. Her daughter was being electrocuted right before her eyes, sparks flickering at the base of the wheelchair like fireflies from hell. Laura lunged forward, yanking the charger free, her hands trembling, tears blinding her vision, but Sophie's small body had already gone limp, head slumping forward in a terrifying stillness, her lips tinged blue. "No, no, no." Laura sobbed, shaking her, begging for a breath, a heartbeat, anything, her cries echoing down the street, drawing curtains to twitch open in curiosity, but not a single neighbor stepped forward to help, cowed as they were by Patterson's authority. And there she stood, arms folded, lips tight, eyes glittering with a satisfaction she tried to hide behind faux concern, whispering just loudly enough for Laura to hear, "Maybe now you'll keep her quiet." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance as Laura clutched Sophie's tiny frame, rocking her, screaming for Michael, for anyone, her knuckles white around her daughter's cold hand, while Patterson turned on her heel and walked calmly back down the path, her silhouette swallowed by the setting sun, leaving behind the image of a broken mother, a lifeless child, and a house that would never again feel safe. And as the ambulance finally screeched to a halt at the curb, paramedics rushing up the porch. With equipment clattering, Laura's sobs tore at the heavens, while Michael, still stuck miles away in traffic, was about to answer a call that would forever shatter the man he thought he was, because that night his family's life had changed forever, And he had no idea that the HOA's queen of cruelty had just lit the spark of a war that would soon bring him back to this neighborhood in a bulletproof suit, carrying vengeance in his heart and fire in his eyes. The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital flickered faintly overhead as Grace sat hunched in a cold metal chair, her hands clasped so tightly around Lily's tiny fingers that her knuckles were bone white, whispering prayers into the silence, even though her voice trembled too much to form coherent words, and every so often she would glance up at the monitor above her daughter's hospital bed, her heart leaping with each weak blip of a line that promised Lily was still fighting, still, clinging to life after the horrific shock that had ravaged her frail body. Daniel burst through the sliding glass doors at that moment, sweat clinging to his brow, his tie askew from the frantic drive, his voice cracking as he shouted his daughter's name, and when he stumbled into the ICU room and saw Lily lying there, pale and motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest under the tangle of wires and machines, his knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed at Grace's side, grabbing their daughter's other hand as tears streamed down his face, guilt gnawing at him like a feral animal because he hadn't been there, hadn't protected her, hadn't shielded her from the cruelty of a neighbor who should never have had that kind of power. She's just a little girl. Grace sobbed, her voice breaking. Why would she? But she couldn't finish, and Daniel didn't answer because rage had hollowed out his insides, leaving only a shaking silence as he stared at Lily's fragile chest rising and falling, the steady beep of the monitor echoing in his skull like a ticking bomb. Outside in the waiting room, however, the mood was disturbingly different because Mrs. Green, the HOA president with her lacquered nails and smug posture, was holding court with a handful of neighbors, spinning the story to protect herself, her voice calm, calculated, dripping with false concern as she declared, "It was a tragic accident, of course, but rules exist for a reason. This family never respected the peace of our community, and the noise, it was unbearable. I simply meant to stop it." And though some of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to openly challenge her, others nodded, eager to avoid her wrath. And with each word she spoke, Daniel's fury grew, because through the thin walls of the ICU, he could hear her voice carrying, shameless and unapologetic, as if Lily's suffering was nothing but an inconvenience to be justified. The doctor entered then, a man with kind eyes dulled by years of bad news, his voice low as he explained that Lily's condition was critical, that the electrical trauma had scarred her nervous system, that her heart was weak, and even if she survived, she might never fully recover, and Grace crumpled against Daniel's shoulder, sobbing so violently that her body shook. While Daniel sat rigid, his eyes locked on his daughter's small frame, every muscle in his body taut as a bowstring because he knew something deep and terrible. This wasn't just about an accident, this was malice, and it was being excused right outside the door. Hours bled together in a haze of antiseptic and tears, nurses rushing in and out, alarms occasionally blaring, and with each passing minute, Daniel's mind replayed the moment over and over that he wasn't there, that he had failed her, until the guilt twisted into something darker, a cold determination coiling around his grief like steel. Then, just as Grace had drifted into a fitful half-sleep with her head on Lily's bedside, the flatline alarm shrieked across the room, a long, unbroken note that sliced Daniel open from the inside out, his heart stopping as he saw his daughter's small body jerk once and then go utterly still, the monitor screaming with its merciless, endless tone, and chaos erupted, nurses flooding the room, a doctor shouting orders, chest compressions starting on Lily's fragile frame, Grace jolting awake with a scream that shook the walls, clutching at her daughter's leg as if by holding her she could keep her in this world, while Daniel stood frozen, his hand pressed against the bulletproof glass, separating his soul from the abyss of loss, tears blurring his vision until all he saw was red. Mrs. Green, hearing the commotion, rose from her chair in the waiting room and smirked faintly, muttering to one of the other board members, "Perhaps now peace will return to the neighborhood." And though her words were meant to be quiet, Daniel caught them as if they had been screamed in his ear, and in that moment, something inside him snapped, a vow forming, in the marrow of his bones, that if Lily's light went out tonight, if their daughter was stolen from them by the cruelty of a woman drunk on petty power, then there would be no corner of this neighborhood safe for Green. No meeting, no dinner, No quiet stroll untouched by the shadow of his wrath, because Daniel was no longer just a father. He was becoming something else, something forged from grief and rage, and as the flatline screamed louder and louder, he knew this night would mark the beginning of a war that would either reclaim his daughter or destroy everything around them in fire. Robert sat in the darkened hospital room with only the faint hum of machines keeping him company, his daughter Mia sleeping restlessly beneath a nest of wires and gauze, her small body shivering occasionally from the trauma that had scarred her nerves, and though the doctors had managed to pull her back from the edge, they warned Angela in hushed tones that her child would never be the same, that the burns would heal, but the damage to her nervous system would haunt her for the rest of her life. And as Angela wept quietly at Mia's bedside, her face hollowed out by grief, Robert's expression hardened into something almost unrecognizable, his eyes fixed not on the fragile child before him, but on the doorway, as if he could see through the hospital walls and into the pristine house of Mrs. Halloway, the HOA president whose cruelty had nearly killed his little girl. That night, when the nurses finally coaxed Angela to rest for a few hours, Robert slipped away, walking aimlessly at first, through the parking lot, but his feet carried him with purpose to the edge of town where an abandoned warehouse stood, a place he had avoided for years because it stirred too many memories of his military past, yet now it called to him like a church to a sinner, a place where his old tools, long hidden, could be repurposed, reforged into something new, something monstrous enough to meet the darkness that had poisoned their lives. In the silence of that cavernous building, with moonlight filtering through broken windows, Robert dragged out crates of old gear, Kevlar plates, hardened steel sheets, scraps of ballistic fabric, and as his hands brushed against them, memories of tours overseas came rushing back, the explosions, the gunfire, the oath he had taken once to protect the innocent, and he realized bitterly that now his oath had been broken because his own daughter had been left unprotected under his watch. Angela, when she discovered his nightly disappearances, begged him to stop, her voice raw with fear as she clutched his arm in their kitchen, whispering, "Robert, please, I can't lose you too. I need Mia to have at least one parent who doesn't fall apart." But Robert pulled away gently, his voice quiet but unyielding. "She was broken under my roof, Angie. I swore to protect her, and I failed. Now, I swear something else. I will never fail again." His nights became consumed with blueprints scrawled across grease-stained paper, his hands blistered from welding, sparks flying as he molded a suit that wasn't just armor but a second skin, forged in silence, fueled by rage, layered with ballistic plating and reinforced joints. Its surface a dull matte black, so it would disappear into shadows. He tested it against knives, against hammers, even against bullets, fired in the dead of night into steel barrels, the impacts reverberating through the warehouse as he perfected every seam, every rivet, until the suit began to take shape, a grim reflection of the man he was becoming. Meanwhile, Mrs. Halloway continued her campaign of cruelty, holding HOA meetings where she painted Mia as a disruption, a liability, insisting that families who can't conform should not live among us, her voice dripping venom as the weaker neighbors bowed their heads, afraid to stand against her, and each report Robert overheard only hardened his resolve, the bitterness calcifying into an oath etched into his very soul. If the system would not punish her, then he would. If the neighborhood would not defend his daughter, then he would become her shield, her avenger, her silent storm. One night, as Mia whimpered in her sleep, her burned hand twitching toward her stuffed toy, Robert knelt beside her bed and whispered into her ear, though she could not hear him through the haze of sedatives, "Daddy's here, sweetheart. They think you're helpless. They think you'll stay broken. But they don't know what's coming. They don't know what your pain has made me." And as a single tear slid down his cheek, it was not of grief anymore, but of fury, crystallized into purpose. The following week, Angela walked into the garage, unannounced, and froze when she saw it, the half-finished exoskeleton standing upright on a rig, plates glinting in the dim light, the smell of gun oil and solder heavy in the air, and she pressed her trembling hand to her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God, Robert, what have you done?" But when he turned to her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes blazing, she saw not madness, but a terrifying clarity, the gaze of a man who had shed the last. Pieces of hesitation. And though she wanted to scream, to stop him, some part of her, deep down, knew that in a world where cruelty reigned unchecked, perhaps this was the only language that monsters like Mrs. Halloway would ever understand. And so, Robert's oath was sealed, not to the government he once served, not to the neighborhood that turned a blind eye, but to his daughter, his broken little girl whose suffering would no longer go unanswered. And as the final sparks flew from his welding torch, illuminating the cold black armor taking shape before him, he whispered into the dark, "This is for you, Mia. For every scream she stole from you. For every tear your mother shed. She thinks you're weak. She thinks we're broken. She has no idea what's coming." The night the suit was finally finished, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the neighborhood itself sensed that something was about to change, and in the dimly lit garage at the end of Willow Lane, David stood over the culmination of weeks of sleepless nights, burned hands, and the relentless pounding of his grief into steel, the armor looming tall on its stand, a matte black exoskeleton lined with Kevlar inserts, reinforced joints, and bulletproof plating that gleamed faintly under the flicker of a single overhead bulb, its surface etched with scars from tests against knives, hammers, even the echoes of bullets that had failed to penetrate. Helen stood in the doorway, her robe pulled tightly around her as if to shield herself from the chilling presence of what her husband had built, her voice breaking as she whispered, "David, please, you're scaring me," but his back remained turned, broad shoulders tense as he adjusted the chest plate with methodical precision, his silence, saying more than words ever could, until finally he turned to face her, his expression carved from stone, eyes burning with the kind of controlled fury that left no room for compromise, and he said in a voice so low it trembled with restrained power, "I warned you, Helen. They took her laughter, her innocence. They broke our child in front of this neighborhood and called it justice. I will not stand by and let her suffer while that woman feasts on her cruelty." Emily, asleep in her room upstairs, whimpered faintly as if sensing the storm gathering in her father's heart, her fragile body still scarred from Mrs. Watkins' public humiliation during the last HOA gathering where she had forced the little girl on stage, mocked her for her wheelchair and ridiculed her stutter until Emily had sobbed uncontrollably before a crowd of snickering neighbors. Helen had begged David to file reports, to call lawyers, to trust the system, but the system had only laughed in their faces, siding with the HOA's queen, and now, as David slipped one leg into the armor and tightened the straps, the hiss of Velcro and click of metal clasps filled the room like the ceremonial preparation of a soldier before battle. Helen collapsed against the doorway, sobbing, whispering, "You're going to lose yourself." But David's reply was ice. "I already did the night," she screamed. The weight of the armor pressed down on him. Yet instead of buckling, he straightened, testing his mobility, each movement smoother than the last, as if the suit had been waiting for him, built not just for protection, but as an extension of his rage, and when he finally pulled the helmet down over his head, sealing himself inside the black shell, the transformation was complete. David, the grieving father, disappeared, and in his place stood something else, a figure that seemed carved from vengeance itself, the dull sheen of the bulletproof suit swallowing the dim light, turning him into a shadow among shadows. He moved silently through the night, slipping into the streets of a neighborhood he once called home, now nothing more than a hunting ground where injustice reigned unchecked, and with every step he replayed Emily's tears, her tiny voice begging him to make it stop, the laughter of Mrs. Watkins and her board members ringing in his ears like a taunt he could never erase. Across the cul-de-sac, Watkins herself was entertaining a small group of sycophants on her perfectly manicured lawn, her shrill laughter piercing the air as she boasted about her latest victory against a family who dared challenge her authority. And though the neighbors clapped politely, their eyes darted nervously to the shadows, where they sensed something unnatural stirring. David remained unseen, crouched behind the hedges, testing the soundless movements of his suit, his heart pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. And for the first time since Emily's torment, he felt control returning to him, a power greater than Watkins' petty rules and HOA fines, because he was no longer playing by her rules, he was creating his own. Hours later, when the gathering ended and Watkins strutted back toward her house, heels clicking against the walkway, she froze, sensing movement in the darkness. But when she turned, there was nothing, only the faint rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind. Yet her glass of wine trembled in her hand, because though she saw nothing, the predator had already marked her, and in that moment her empire began to crumble. Back in the garage, David removed the helmet, sweat dripping from his temples, adrenaline still surging, and when Helen confronted him again, demanding, "What are you planning to do?" he looked her in the eye and delivered a chilling promise. "I'm going to show her what fear feels like. I'm going to make sure she never touches Emily or anyone again. And if the law won't stop her, I will." Upstairs, Emily stirred in her sleep, whispering for her father, as if she already knew that he had become something new, something unbreakable, and the hunt had only just begun. The neighborhood clubhouse had never looked so lavish, its chandeliers glowing like 100 captive suns over tables draped in silk, crystal glasses clinking as laughter and shallow conversation filled the room. The entire HOA board gathered to celebrate their so-called victory in maintaining order, but beneath the polished smiles was the smug, commanding presence of Mrs. Thompson, her sequined gown shimmering under the lights, as if to announce she was queen of this community, her shrill laugh piercing through every corner as she toasted to peace and discipline at last. And seated quietly near the back was Rachel, clutching Olivia's small hand in her lap, her daughter's eyes downcast, scar from the burn still faintly visible along her arm. And though Rachel had begged Ethan not to bring them here, he had insisted that they sit in silence, watch, and let the arrogance of Thompson and her circle expose itself. Because tonight was not for words, it was for judgment. Behind the closed doors of the clubhouse, the party swelled with self-congratulation, music humming softly from a live quartet, neighbors nervously clapping at every declaration Thompson made. Her words dripping with venom as she recalled how some children simply don't belong among civilized people, and Rachel's fingers dug into Olivia's tiny palm, trying to shield her ears, but the words still pierced, reopening wounds that had never healed. And then, just as Thompson raised her glass to deliver the final toast, the lights flickered once, twice, and then cut out completely, plunging the grand hall into suffocating darkness, gasps rippling through the crowd, chairs scraping, whispers rising into panic, and in the heavy silence that followed, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the far end of the room, each metallic step striking the marble floor like a drumbeat of doom, until from the shadows emerged a figure clad in matte black, broad-shouldered, towering, his eyes concealed behind a visor that glowed faintly with a cold light. Ethan, encased in the bulletproof suit that made him appear less man than shadow, less father than retribution itself. Neighbors shrank back, clutching their pearls, whispering prayers. But no one dared move as he walked calmly down the center aisle, his presence swallowing the room. And when Mrs. Thompson finally found her voice, it was not the confident bark of an HOA tyrant, but a trembling stammer. "Who are you? What is the meaning of this?" Ethan stopped at the head table, his towering figure casting her into shadow, and his voice, amplified and distorted by the helmet, rolled across the silence like thunder. "You know exactly who I am. I am the father of the girl you tried to break, the one you humiliated, mocked, and nearly killed. You thought she was weak. You thought we were helpless. But you forgot. Fathers don't forget. Fathers don't forgive." Gasps rippled, glasses shattered as trembling hands lost their grip, and Thompson tried to regain composure, forcing a laugh that quavered under her breath. This is absurd, some sort of Halloween trick, but her eyes betrayed the fear clawing inside her, because the man before her was no prank, no costume. He was the embodiment of everything she had unleashed, and Ethan leaned closer, his visor inches from her trembling face, his voice dropping into a whisper that carried across the hushed room. "You tried to silence her voice with pain. Now I will silence your empire with truth." He slammed a gloved fist onto the table, the wood cracking under the force, and from a compartment on his suit, he produced a small projector, tossing it into the center of the hall, where it splashed the walls with hidden recordings, videos, documents, HOA meeting notes Ethan had secretly collected for weeks, exposing Thompson's corruption, her illegal fines, her bullying tactics, even her backroom deals with contractors that stole thousands from the very neighbors she lorded over. The crowd gasped, murmurs breaking into shouts, neighbors turning on one another as the lies unraveled before their eyes, and Thompson's face drained of color, her kingdom collapsing in real time. But still she tried to rise, her voice shrieking, "You have no right to come here," but she was cut off as Ethan's hand slammed down again, rattling the glasses, and his distorted voice roared. "No right? You had no right to touch my child. No right to treat the innocent like trash beneath your shoes. Tonight, you answer for every tear, every scream, every broken heart you left in your wake." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint sobs of Olivia, who clutched Rachel's arm, whispering, "Daddy," her voice trembling, and for the first time in months, Ethan turned his helmeted head toward his daughter, raising a hand not in violence, but in reassurance, his voice softening. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now." The neighbors stared, transfixed, because what stood before them was not just vengeance. It was love forged into armor, grief sharpened into steel, and though Thompson tried to scream for security, for police, for anyone to save her, none came, because every soul in that room had seen the truth, and her reign of terror was over. But Ethan did not strike her, not yet, because this was only the beginning, the reckoning had only just begun, and as the lights flickered back on, illuminating the destruction of Thompson's illusion of power, Ethan stepped back into the shadows, his voice echoing one final warning: "This is only the first night. I am not leaving until justice is done." The neighborhood had descended into chaos after the revelations at the clubhouse, neighbors shouting, phones flashing with recordings that would soon spread beyond the gates of their pristine community. But amid the storm of betrayal and collapsing lies, Ms. Whitaker, the once untouchable tyrant of the HOA, slipped out a side door, her sequined heels clicking frantically on the pavement as she muttered curses under her breath, clutching her handbag like a lifeline, because for the first time, she felt what she had inflicted on so many others, fear, raw and suffocating, curling in her chest as she rushed toward her car parked in the shadows, her shaking hands fumbling for the keys. But just as she reached the door handle, a metallic clang echoed behind her, slow and deliberate, and she froze, turning her head only to see a dark figure stepping into the streetlight, broad-shouldered, visor glowing faintly blue, Jonathan in the suit, his presence radiating silent menace like a predator stalking its prey, and Whitaker's breath caught in her throat, panic surging as she scrambled into the car, slamming the lock button and jamming the keys into the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, tires screeching as she tore down the empty street, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where Jonathan remained, not running, not chasing, but walking steadily, each step like a promise that no matter how fast she fled, she could not escape. Houses blurred past as she sped through the manicured neighborhood, manicured lawns and white fences suddenly feeling like prison bars closing in, her mind racing with escape routes, with excuses she might still spin to police or lawyers. But no lie could wash away the truth that had been projected for all to see. And just as she rounded a corner, heart pounding, she saw the silhouette again. Jonathan, standing at the intersection, as if he had been waiting for her, his suit gleaming faintly in the moonlight, impossibly calm as though the very streets bent to his path, and Whitaker screamed, swerving wildly to avoid him, the car nearly clipping a mailbox before she regained control, her breath ragged, her fingers white-knuckled on the wheel, sweat dripping down her temple as she drove faster, faster, until the pristine neighborhood gave way to the industrial outskirts, the neat rows of houses replaced by looming warehouses and empty lots where shadows pooled thick and heavy. She pulled into a deserted parking lot, killing the headlights, her chest heaving as she sat in the suffocating silence, whispering to herself that she just needed to think, just needed to breathe. But then, tap, tap, the sound of metal knuckles against glass, and she turned slowly, dread crawling up her spine, to see Jonathan crouched outside the driver's window, his visor reflecting her own terrified face back at her, and before she could scream, before she could reach for her phone, he spoke in that deep, distorted voice that felt less human than judgment itself. "You can run through every street in this city, but the truth runs faster. You can hide in shadows, but I am the shadow you created." She shoved the gear shift into reverse, the tires squealing as the car shot backward, nearly clipping a lamppost, and she bolted back onto the road, tears streaking her cheeks now, because it wasn't just Jonathan's pursuit. It was her past, every neighbor she had fined, every child she had bullied, every cruel laugh she had delivered that now echoed in her ears, a choir of ghosts that made escape impossible. Somewhere across town, Elena and Grace sat in their darkened living room, Elena's arms wrapped tightly around her daughter as the news notifications exploded across her phone. Videos of Whitaker's corruption, testimonies from neighbors, whispers that law enforcement was already circling. But Grace only whispered one thing as she clutched her mother's blouse. "Is Daddy okay?" And Elena, though trembling, kissed her forehead and whispered back, "He's doing this for you, sweetheart. He's finally ending it." Meanwhile, Whitaker's car barreled through the night until she reached the edge of the river where the bridge stretched out like a thin thread over dark waters, and for a fleeting moment she thought escape lay on the other side, freedom beyond the city lights. But halfway across she saw him again. Jonathan, standing in the center of the bridge as if he had been waiting all along, his black suit blending into the night, visor gleaming like a phantom, and in that moment she realized the horrible truth. It wasn't just that he was chasing her, he was always ahead of her, always watching, as if her sins had paved the road she was doomed to walk. She slammed the brakes, tires screeching as the car skidded sideways, metal groaning, and she tumbled out, her heels clattering against the asphalt as she ran, sobbing, screaming into the night. "Leave me alone. I didn't mean it. It was just rules. Just rules." But her words dissolved into the darkness, meaningless against the weight of what she had done, and Jonathan advanced slowly, steadily, his voice reverberating across the river. "Rules don't burn children. Rules don't electrocute innocence. That was you. And now, every step you take away from me is a step deeper into your own grave." She stumbled, falling to her knees, her once perfect gown torn and filthy, her makeup streaked, the queen of the neighborhood reduced to a shivering wreck as the sound of Jonathan's metallic boots closed in, echoing off the steel beams of the bridge. And though he did not raise a weapon, though he did not lay a hand on her, the terror of his presence, the inevitability of his pursuit, was worse than any blade, because Ms. Whitaker finally understood. This was not just a man in a suit. This was the judgment she had mocked, the justice she had sneered at, and it had finally come for her. The bridge trembled under the weight of the wind, steel beams groaning as if nature itself was holding its breath. And there in the center stood Marcus, visor glowing faintly in the dark, every line of his armored suit etched with power and pain, while Mrs. Caldwell crawled backward across the asphalt, her sequined gown shredded, her mascara streaking down her cheeks like war paint of a fallen tyrant, her voice cracking with desperate shrieks that blended with the howling night air. "You can't do this. I'm important. I built this community. Without me, these people are nothing." But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't blink, his distorted voice cutting through her words like a blade. "You built nothing. You poisoned it. You took their money, their peace, their dignity, and when my little girl cried out for help, you silenced her with pain. You don't deserve their fear anymore. You deserve their truth." Caldwell scrambled to her feet, staggering, her heels breaking on the uneven pavement, her arms flailing as she tried to put distance between them. But no matter how far she moved, Marcus was there, his presence like a shadow fused to her soul, each step of his boots echoing like the toll of a funeral bell, and in her panic she lunged toward the guardrail, gripping the cold steel, her eyes darting to the churning black waters below, whispers spilling from her lips like prayers. "I didn't mean. It was an accident. She was too loud. I just wanted order. I never." But her voice cracked as Marcus raised a gloved hand, projecting into the night sky. Above them, the images, the videos, the testimonies of neighbors who had suffered under her cruelty, every face lit up against the clouds, flickering like ghosts called to witness, and the wind carried their words, mothers recalling sleepless nights, fathers recounting stolen wages, children confessing fears of playing outside, and in the center of it all was Sophia's fragile, trembling voice whispering, "Why did you hurt me?" And Caldwell screamed, dropping to her knees, covering her ears as if she could drown out the truth, her sobs breaking through the silence. But Marcus's voice thundered over her cries. "You cannot hide. Not from her. Not from me. Not from justice." Neighbors who had followed, drawn by the chaos, began to gather at the far end of the bridge, their cell phones raised. their faces pale as they watched their once feared ruler crumble into a broken shell, and Lydia stood among them with Sophia in her arms. Her eyes locked on Marcus, tears streaming down her cheeks because she knew this moment was the climax of everything they had suffered, and Sophia, her tiny voice quivering, whispered, "Daddy?" And Marcus turned his head. Just enough, his visor catching the faint moonlight, his voice softening but still echoing with weight. "I'm here, princess. This ends tonight." Caldwell tried one last desperate act, pulling a small pistol from her purse, her hands shaking so violently the weapon nearly slipped from her grip, and she leveled it at him, her voice high, hysterical. "Stay back. I'll shoot. You think you're untouchable in that stupid suit, but I'll end this right now." And for the first time, Marcus stopped, not in fear, but in solemn stillness, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper that carried across the entire bridge. "Go ahead. Pull the trigger. Do to me what you did to her. But understand this, you can kill a man, but you cannot kill what you've unleashed tonight. The truth will never die. And even if I fall, every single person here will carry it." The crowd gasped as Caldwell's hand shook harder, sweat dripping from her brow, her finger trembling on the trigger. But she couldn't do it. The weight of the truth, the weight of Sophia's voice, the weight of dozens of eyes watching her, stripped away the illusion of control she had wielded for so long, and with a strangled cry she dropped the gun, it clattering against the asphalt, her body collapsing in a heap of sobs and gasps, begging, pleading, broken, "Please, please don't let them. Take me. Don't let them see me like this. I'll change. I'll fix it. I'll do anything." But Marcus only stood above her, towering, silent, the embodiment of every sleepless night and every tear she had caused. And after a long, heavy pause, he turned, his voice resonant but final. "Justice isn't mine to give anymore. It belongs to them." He pointed toward the crowd, and slowly the neighbors advanced, their faces grim, their phones still recording, their voices rising not in chaos now, but in unison calling for accountability, for law, for the end of her tyranny, and Caldwell shrieked, backing away until her heels slipped on the edge of the bridge, her arms flailing as she teetered, the crowd gasping. But Marcus moved swiftly, his armored hand shooting out, grabbing her wrist before she could plunge into the abyss below, pulling her back to the pavement with a force that rattled the steel. And for a moment she stared up at him, stunned, confused, whispering, Why save me?" And Marcus, his visor glinting with the reflection of Sophia's eyes, replied in a voice stripped of distortion, raw and human. "Because my daughter still believes in mercy, even when you never gave her any." He released her, and police sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue lights flickering against the water as cars sped toward the bridge, the crowd parting to let them through, and Marcus stepped back, his suit humming softly, his gaze never leaving Caldwell as officers cuffed her, dragging her away while she screamed her innocence, her empire shattered, her mask on, and when the noise faded, when the crowd finally dispersed, Lydia stepped forward, Sophia still in her arms, and Marcus removed his helmet, his eyes weary but burning with love as he reached for his daughter, pulling her close against the cold steel of his chest, whispering, "It's over now. You're safe." And though the night air was heavy with storm, though the bridge still groaned under the weight of what had transpired for the first time in so long, Sophia smiled, her small fingers brushing his cheek, whispering back, "Daddy saved me." And in that fragile, radiant moment, the suit was no longer armor, no longer vengeance. It was simply a father's promise fulfilled.